Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world watching us today. This is episode number 7 of the Apostate Alliance with your hosts, Rahman and John Petersen. Today we are joined by Haafizah of Atheist Muslim South Africa. As I always like to say, here at the Apostate Alliance, you can be free to not believe, and you're joined by 3 non-believers today. We're going to hear from Haafizah in a few minutes. I just want to say right off the bat that we will be talking next week with a friend and associate of Haafizah's known as Shmariana Shmonde on the Twitterverse, and we call him M. So look for that next week, same time. And want to also say that if you are an ex-Muslim or you are an apostate of any religion, we would love it if you'd contact us and you could come on as a guest. You can DM myself or Faye if you'd like to do that. We do this every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, U.S. And we can, of course, adjust that time. If you're somewhere in the world that doesn't work. We always start the show talking about some different news items and what have you. And we are going to do that as a group here, comment on something that's pretty big in the news right now. But there's one thing I want to share that somebody tweeted the other day, and I found it, very poignant. If I can find it here. But I'm not going to share the person's name, but this kind of wrenched my heart. And this is in reference to the COVID that's going on and how everybody is quarantining and isolating. And this ex-Muslim, I'm assuming an ex-Muslim or maybe a closeted Muslim, that hasn't come out yet as ex-Muslim. But this young lady had tweeted, I live in a Saudi household, so I've been in quarantine all my life. And that just kind of touched my heart to think that, everybody's kind of complaining about having to be quarantined. Not everybody, but some folks are complaining about that. And here she's pointing out that, if you're a female in some Muslim countries, you live in quarantine every day, all day. But what we want to talk about to start with, as everybody probably knows, there's a lot of tumult here in the United States ever since George Floyd was, and I'm going to say the word, he was murdered by that police officer. There has been riots and an uprising, and there's been some nonviolent protests, but in a lot of areas it has turned violent. And it's just a really hard situation. I mean, it's all over the country. It's not just in the city where George was murdered by that police officer. It's in a lot of major cities here in the United States. And I want to first, throw it to my co-host to get her thoughts on what's going on, and then we will hear from Haafizah. Faye?
So in terms of myself, I wanted to do a dedicated video or live stream at some point in the week about this. My main issue with the whole situation is that I'm not well informed about race relations and anything around identity politics. I don't know too much about, because I'm not someone who keeps on top of the news. I'm already invested in my own little controversies with what I do, what I am an activist for. So this kind of thing escapes me. But when I heard about it, I must have heard about it on Thursday or Friday. I'm still kind of processing it, and obviously it's a terrible thing, but I don't know this. I don't know about this from all angles, so I don't feel like I'm ready to really comment on it.
Yep, no problem. It's always best to have all the information. Haafizah, would you like to comment? You are muted, by the way.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, firstly, I do want to say thank you for having me, because yeah, it's not always that we sort of get, to air our views, and especially as ex-Muslims, but also as ex-Muslims in the global South, to be to speak about our experiences and so on. So I do want to say thank you. In terms of the protests, I think it is something that definitely touches my heart, just because as a country, we've experienced a lot of police brutality in the past, racialized police brutality, that is. Yeah, in terms of the violence and so on, I think it's sort of almost inevitable. For a very long time, Black Lives Matter was a movement that was characterized by sort of liberal politics and so on. And as it starts to become a little bit more, I guess, toothier, it is receiving some backlash. But then again, it's always received backlash. And I think one thing that does stand out for me, and that is a concern for me, is that you never want movements like that to become hijacked. So I was reading a funny article, or not an article, a Facebook post, where these people were basically praising, that these different gangs had come together to show solidarity. And I was like, that is ridiculous, because you don't want a movement like that to get hijacked by, a force that shouldn't be there. But yeah, that's sort of.
Well, and the thing is too, and we were talking about this before we went live, that I had read, in a few different articles, that there are outside groups joining these protests to try and foment more violence. That really, are, like alt-right groups and, neo-Nazis and things like that are joining in just to make sure that the tumultuous situation just continues on. I haven't really heard any mainstream media talk about this yet, but yeah, I think that in these type situations, you're always going to get outside groups in trying to affect the situation.
I think there's always going to be people who will hijack a movement for their own gain. And we see that every time there's some kind of global crisis, or any kind of crisis, really. There's always groups of people that try to hijack a tragedy for their own personal agenda, which is just disgusting for me to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you'd like to, see more about this situation that's currently going on in the United States, I urge you to go to this channel's homepage, and Nakasuchi, our channel owner, he did a live stream yesterday about what's going on here in the United States. So please try and catch that if you can. And we're gonna get to Haafizah here, our guest today, and thank you so much for joining us. The first thing we want to do is we want to let Haafizah take as much time as she wants to tell us about her organization in South Africa. Atheist Muslims, South Africa. So Haafizah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll try to do it as much justice as I can. So we started off as an organization called Ex-Muslims of South Africa, and that was in, I think it was late 2017. And there were just a few of us. I think there was a handful of us, maybe between 8 and 10, 12 people. So there really weren't that many of us. And we were, I think for the most part, just frustrated because the conversation had stagnated around progress in our own communities and in sort of having diverse voices in that community. And then last year we decided to sort of change our outlook and sort of broaden our outlook to include a more open discourse and be able to do interactions like this and so on. So that's when we decided to make the move from ex-Muslims of South Africa to atheist Muslims, just because we felt like it would better represent us as an organization. And yeah, and then here we are. I think the two main things that we do focus on are, you know, creating a community for ex-Muslims in South Africa, and there aren't that many of us. The Muslim community in South Africa, as it stands, is not a very big community. So naturally, the atheist Muslim community would not be very big. But we do that, and I think it's also very important because the vast majority of ex-Muslims that I interact with are closeted. I could say, you know, 95% of the ex-Muslims that I know of in South Africa and that I interact with are closeted and, you know, completely terrified of actually coming out to their friends and their families and their communities because they would receive backlash for that. So it is important for us to have a sort of community where people can come together and talk, and we have, you know, physical meetups and so on, so people can feel a little bit less lonely in the experience. And the other aim of the organization is to create a conversation wherein we speak to issues like gender and LGBT issues and so on in the Muslim community, because we still see ourselves as part of the Muslim community to some degree, mostly because we're all still affected by it. And if you're still affected by it, then you can't say that you're outside of it. So yeah, that's been something that we focused on quite heavily this year and last year, even though there hasn't been too much progress this year just because of all of the world-ending situations that are going on. But yeah, that's the gist of it.
And now I see you have a presence on Twitter, but is there a website that we can point people to?
We don't have a website. Mostly, we did have a website, and then we decided to get rid of it because we had no content to put on the website. So yeah, we have a Twitter and a Facebook. That's what we
okay, Facebook too, and we'll make sure and get those links in the video description once this post is a video. And so now I'm going to hand it over to my co-host Faye to talk with Haafizah. They've never interacted one-on-one, but they move in the same circles. And as a matter of fact, as we mentioned a few moments ago, Shmariana Shmande is a big friend of Faye's and works with Haafizah at the organization. So I'm going to pass it over to Faye and let them talk.
So first and foremost, really, really good to have you on the show, and I hope you're comfortable. You've got some tea, you've got some coffee, and you're just relaxing. It is a Sunday, so you're right. With all the world ending going on right now, I think it's really, really important to be just, as comfortable as possible. There's not much we can do about it besides that. But how are you, and how are you coping in the lockdown?
Good. We've had a really, really long lockdown. It's been going on since late March. So it's been a lot of time spent at home and indoors. And yeah, I mean, but I'm coping, I think, quite fine. Ramadan was a little bit of a hassle just because I still live with my family and they're all Muslim. They're not super conservative, but they are Muslim. So it was the occasional argument happened, but yeah, overall good. And yourself?
Well, I live by myself, so I've had it relatively easy. Besides my extroversion, just dying of starvation. I haven't had any physical contact for 79 days now.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's another thing. I thought in the beginning that counting was a good idea, but I'm realizing that maybe it isn't. But that's a discussion for another day. But it's good to hear that you're doing okay with, the minor setbacks. Ramadan, I feel as though probably was a more stressful time. Now that Ramadan is over, I'm hoping that people can go back to some level of normalcy with their families and all of that kind of stuff. But it's good to hear that you're doing well. In terms of I remember when the atheist Muslims of South Africa were actually called the ex-Muslims of South Africa. because I think it was started a year ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the Twitter account, yeah.
Yeah, so I remember, and I also remember once you changed the name, because your name is taken from Ali Rizvi's book, right, The Atheist Muslim, and it's meant to kind of denote the standard of, yes, we are atheists, but we still hold a place in the Muslim community, and we still have a level of Muslim culture, because that's where we come from, which I kind of agree with. It wouldn't really be a label that I would adopt, but I kind of agree with that understanding. I do think that ex-Muslims, generally speaking, are, you know, still part of the Muslim community because of the way that we've been brought up, because of what the majority of our communities are made up of. But I also remember that a lot of people had a problem with the name change from ex-Muslim to atheist Muslim. And I think it's important to clarify that. So tell us about the background of the name, and also why the transition happened. I think that would be nice.
Yeah, I noticed that too when I was when we posted our sort of like statement on why we changed the name. A lot of people sort of commented, and they were upset about it because they didn't want to see themselves as a part of the Muslim community at all. And we just found that you know, it was a decision that we made over a long period of time. We had a lot of discussion about it. So yeah, we were not as much shaken by that. But to kind of dig into the reasons for changing it to atheist Muslims, the biggest one was because we want to still be able to have legitimate discourses with the Muslim community. And this is important in terms of wanting to destigmatize being an ex-Muslim, and being able to see being an ex-Muslim just as being, you know, any sort of sector of the Muslim community. And it definitely comes at an interesting time, because as we speak, you know, the Muslim community here in South Africa is diversifying quite a bit. So you have young people who are just kind of disillusioned with the conservatism or the traditional sort of aspects of their communities. And of course, you know, the bubble has been popped post-apartheid, so everybody is now interacting, and a lot of Muslim people for the first time are going to schools where they're interacting with people who have diverse ideas on religion and so on, and then, you know, rethinking some of the ideas that they have coming from a Muslim background. So a lot of young Muslim people are going, actually, I want to be, you know, feminist in my views, or I want to be liberal in my views, or I want to be, you know, a little bit more open-minded, or maybe I was raised in sort of a Sunni conservative family, but I want to practice a sort of Sufism or whatever it is. And to me, that signals progress, because it means that in this community, people are starting to challenge their own ideas and challenge their own backgrounds. So we wanted to be a part of that conversation, which I think is an important conversation. And we didn't want to see it be seen as this group that is like antagonistic to Muslims or anti-Muslims. So sort of, you know, keeping the word Muslim in the name was important to us. But also, I think just because when somebody sees the term ex-Muslim, they immediately go, oh, I don't like that person. That person is an enemy. Whereas if somebody sees the word atheist Muslim, there's a kind of curiosity to it, you know, like, what does that mean? Who are you?
Yeah. I do agree with that. I do think that, generally speaking, when someone sees ex-Muslim, there is a stigma attached to it immediately, being, well, this is a person that I just have to avoid. However, I do want to say that, well, the first thing I want to point out is, with a lot of people being angry at the name change and people being like, oh, you know, you're abandoning the movement. That I saw a lot of that, and we do come across a lot of that, because you know, especially when it comes to these movements that are so entangled in people's feelings and people's emotions and people's loyalties, people get really, really angry when anything changes. But I would like to say that there isn't just one way of revolutionizing something, of changing something. There are many different ways of going about it. And while I personally would not take on the atheist Muslim label, because it just seems very confusing to me, and I understand that that's kind of the point. Like, I would not take on that label. It is a label that I would support, because those people who might find the ex-Muslim label to be, you know, unfavorable, would probably find an avenue where there are activists with the atheist Muslim label, and you know, they would ask, you know, target their discourse in that direction, which in my opinion is positive regardless. The more of activism, the better often. So I was initially, I wasn't surprised by, I don't think it would be exaggerating to call it outrage. I think it was outrage when ex-Muslims of South Africa became the atheist Muslims of South Africa. I wasn't surprised by it, but also it was just disappointing to see, because anytime anyone has like a different opinion or they want to change something, it becomes like a thing, especially on the internet. But it's good. I do like the overall message that atheist Muslims of South Africa have, and I know that I participated in a campaign that you guys had a few months ago. I don't know if it's an ongoing campaign for It Is Not a Choice, which was you wouldn't really call it a anti-hijab campaign. you would call it a choice campaign, but I don't know how to phrase it. It was to talk about people's experiences while they were wearing hijab and how they feel following taking it off and things like that. And I did one live stream with one of your associates, Shmariana or M. We've had that on on my channel, and following that I also participated by doing a video where I did how I did my makeup as a Salafi Muslim and explained how that stifled me. It's a really funny video, but anyway, it's interesting. You're in an interesting place. You're in South Africa, and South Africa, as everyone ought to know, is an extremely diverse community. You have all colors of people, all people from all walks of life. How is it different, do you think? Because I think a lot of the ex-Muslim voices, we do come from the West. We come from the UK, from Canada, from the US. South Africa is in a place where we hear a lot of, at least public ex-Muslims speak out. So how is the environment different, do you think, from more of the Western countries and the Western voices? What challenges are different to those people who are in South Africa? How is the Muslim community in South Africa taking the ex-Muslim or atheist Muslim movement? How is it all working?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's quite a complex thing. I don't know how different it is, but I do know that it is different. Yeah, we're a much smaller community. We're a much smaller group of people. And I think, you know, I mentioned this before, but sort of the insulation of the Muslim community is kind of like a bubble. And so, and this is obviously because of the past sort of like racial profiling and so on. People had to live in specific areas and in specific communities. So people became very sort of insulated by a certain way of thinking and a certain way of acting. And that, you know, a lot of people have sort of broken out of it, but it's only been 20 something years. So there are many people who haven't. So you have kind of a large number of the Muslim community just being conservative or traditional rather. And then you have, you know, people who are starting to become extremely liberal and extremely invested in you know, non-traditional, non-conservative ideas. So in that way, we do face a lot of backlash from the more conservative elements, just because they're shocked and appalled. Yeah, and you know, in sort of the south of Africa, I guess, the Muslim community is very strong, and it's seen as this like shining torch for other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So you have you know, certain Muslim organizations, for example, who are based in Johannesburg or Cape Town or wheresoever, and they'll, you know, do dawah movements in Malawi or in Zimbabwe, and it just becomes, you know, a thing where the South African Muslim,
movement, or it is a Tabligh movement. It sounds like it.
Yeah. We have a very big Tablighi community, especially here in Joburg, where I am. Yeah, and we have a lot of problems with the Dawa movement, especially because South Africa is such a stratified country in terms of wealth inequality. And so you have people who are extremely poor, and you have these, individuals kind of going into poor communities and like trading food for belief. And
Oh,
it very
wow.
quickly,
That's
it very,
dark.
it's it's terrifying if you think about it.
It's almost
But it's so
culty.
sort of naturalized. Yeah.
Um, yeah, the reason I ask is because here in the UK we are seeing growing numbers of like conservatism. I wouldn't really call it radicalism, though I do think that it can definitely lead into that direction. But there's certainly the conservative movement, the Salafi movement, or the Wahhabi movement is definitely growing here in the UK. In the US, things are slightly more lax and slightly more liberal. But I don't know which way it might be going in South Africa, because it's quite literally a world apart from us. It's not something that we could possibly understand. I would like to ask if the Dawa movement or the conservative movement in South Africa, do you think it's also tied to identity politics? Because I do think that the Dawa movement here in the UK is definitely tied to identity politics, especially with the fear of anti-Muslim bigotry, Islamophobia, and things like that, which are real things. But it seems as though that a lot of people become more conservative so as to retain some form of identity. Do you think that it's the same in South Africa?
Yeah, we often, during our meetups and things, chat about how, there's a sort of traceable difference in the way that the Muslim community behaves. Going back 10 years or so, you can see that there is a certain, I guess you could say, section of society that has become more and more conservative. And this is, it's definitely tied to identity, because I think people, oftentimes we get criticized as ex-Muslims or as atheists for being too sort of Western or too, influenced by the West, and that's sort of seen as a bad thing. So then naturally the opposite of that would be to just hang on so tightly to religion and become more and more religious in order to believe that you are retaining your identity as a brown person or as as whatever it is. And I think that that's dangerous, especially here, because we come straight out of a history of like colonialism and so on, and race is such an important topic of discussion, that if people are seeing themselves as, I'm only truly liberated or truly decolonized or whatever if I become more and more Islamic, that's dangerous. And for the first
dangerous.
it's and it's terrifying, and it's untrue, because it's almost one of the biggest reasons why I left Islam was because I felt like it was imperial itself, and that it was consuming my identity as an Indian person or as an African person. But some people might see themselves, well, if I wear the niqab, then I'm more decolonized, and yet that's not. It has nothing to do with the actual identity.
I think that colonialism and well, it's a big conversation now about like we hear the phrase post-colonial and post-colonial master syndrome being thrown around by certain people in the Dawa community. Like, for example, myself and other ex-Muslims here in the UK have fallen under the syndrome. I think that it's a really interesting idea that people seem to think that, for example, myself being more British or aligning to British values makes us these like Uncle Sams or Uncle Toms, I don't know what they're called, of Britain, that you are submitting to the colonial power. Whereas with Islam was a colonial power. They had an empire, they had colonies. Why do you think that clearly there's a bias, but why does this bias exist, do you think? Is it because that a lot of the people who are Muslims most people who are Muslims are born into Muslim families and they're taught these values and they just don't have that they seem to have blinkers about the colonialism of Islam, or do you think it's something else?
I think it could. I mean, that definitely has an aspect of it, but I also think that it's because we don't have the sort of conversation that would lead people to be able to see it in that way. So because the conversation is always, well, colonialism has a race and it has an origin, then you don't really think, well, colonialism
With
can
the white
also
man.
come from, yeah. So,
Yeah.
if that's the only place that colonialism comes from, then everybody else is just the oppressed and the colonized. And yet it's more complicated than that, and we don't always talk about it. So people don't tend to see it that way.
Yeah, I don't know. I've had discussions with a lot of people around colonialism, and it's very interesting because Islam, unlike a lot of other religions, which people kind of practice willy-nilly, I don't want to be offensive, but they kind of do. Like with Christians, they only really go to church once a week. Hindus, they do their prayers, and that's about it. It's very lax compared to how all-encompassing Islam is, because Islam kind of dictates the way you live your entire life. Which is why it's so difficult to leave Islam. It's because everyone is suddenly so invested in it. It's not just a colonial power in the sense that it had colonies and it was an empire in its time. It's also colonial in the sense that it kind of takes over your life. It's almost like
it does.
It's almost parasitic in the way that it invades everything in your life. And it's just really, I don't really know. It's almost, I don't want to call it hypocritical, but it's almost ironic that people who do dawah and preach Islam and who will talk down to ex-Muslims will tell us that we're submitting to a colonial power, when Islam doesn't really have an empire anymore, but they're still under the influence of it. It's a little crazy.
It's an especially crazy thing to see here, because you have people who are either like Cape Malay or Indian in origin, living in Africa, practicing this Arab religion that is foreign to them, speaking in Arabic and teaching people a religion in an Arabic text and dressing as if they're Arab, and then thinking that that's decolonial. It's just very weird, and it's very weird.
Completely decolonial. You're Indian or you're Pakistani, and you're using all Arab terms. You're dressing in Arab clothes.
Exactly. You have to at some point realize that that's.
I remember when we went to Speaker's Corner at some point last year, we were talking to Adnan Rashid, who's quite prominent on the on the proselytizing preaching scene here in the UK, and he wholeheartedly agreed, and it was refreshing actually. He just went ahead and he agreed. He said that I submit to Islam's colonialism. I agree with it, and it was like, okay, all right. And he said the colonialism that I'm against is specifically British colonialism. And I was like,
that's
all right, okay. It just changes everything. But moving away from more identity politics focused things, well, I don't think we can move away by talking about religion. I understand that there are certain things that you are uncomfortable talking about with your journey out of Islam, but it would be nice to know, because you said that one of the reasons was the imperialism within Islam, which is something not only happened after Islam, it was within Islam's conception. Muhammad had his own little empire in olden day Saudi. So there was the imperialism within Islam that you disagreed with. Were there other reasons? Were there other sort of pushes and pulls to you leaving the religion of peace?
Yeah, sure. I think I've had a little bit of a different journey than many, and that's because generally when I speak to people who have left Islam, they tell me that the reason why they left Islam was because it didn't make sense, or because it was scientifically inaccurate. And to be honest, that all just went like, it just flew by me. I didn't see it somehow. For me, it was much more, from a very young age, I was politicized. And I come from a politicized family, a politicized community. So I was politicized into all of these movements, various, political activism movements. And I started to develop my own sort of identity about what I felt regarding morality and ethics and fairness and justice and equality. And one of the big things for me was just being a woman in that community. I felt like it was unjust and it was unfair, that there was something incredibly dehumanizing about it, and that I couldn't continue to belong to that community whilst also saying that I believe in women's rights or, any other part of my identity just being stripped away from me. It felt like a very hard thing. So I had to, in many ways, I was just so torn that I felt like I had to make the decision about whether I wanted to be Muslim or whether I wanted to be, what I believe to be a good person. And I couldn't see myself being a good person and a Muslim, or a good person and Islamically inclined.
That's really interesting, the way that people define what a good person is, or what it is to be a good person, and then have it conflict with your core beliefs is, I feel like it's a lot of things that religious people struggle with. And we see it throughout, not just with Muslims, but the examples that I can think of are Muslims. Like, you have certain feminist Muslim people who will say that Islam is the most feminist religion, and they'll cherry pick certain things about Islam that are marginally feminist. They're not really, but it's strange, and it's very conflicting in its nature. But I also want to say that politicism and the Muslim community is really, it's like a thing, right? It's definitely a thing. Like, it's not just me. I feel like I know that when I was young, I had like the rebel spirit. Like, you always want to be fighting something, and I think you're brought up in that way, that everyone else is an enemy and you have to fight for what you believe in. And it's really funny, because now I still have that character, but it's definitely being projected in the wrong direction now.
They've created a monster.
Well, I've said this for a very, very long time, that ex-Muslims would not exist if Muslims didn't persecute us. We would not exist as a community, and we are a creation of their own making, in a way. But this kind of politicism is what children in Muslim communities are brought up in, because we're constantly made to feel as though we're under attack. And the whole idea of the Muslim ummah, the Muslim community worldwide, is like one body, and if one part of the body hurts, then the whole body feels it. In a way, it's very, very unifying, but at the same time, it's extremely otherizing to other kinds of people.
Definitely.
So did you experience that while you were growing up? And I think what would be like a fun detour is also to talk about some conspiracy theories that you were brought up with. Because I feel like anything that happens in the world, there's always some Muslim person that has an opinion, and it's a conspiracy theory. So yeah, please take it away.
So in terms of like the whole concept of the Muslim Ummah and so on, and being brought up in that way, definitely the sort of politicization I had was around causes that had to do with the Ummah. So I was, a 13-year-old who was protesting for Syria, or collecting funds for, and I mean, Palestine was a huge one. Just, I don't know, like every year that march would happen, and I would be made to go along. And I actually remember when I was quite young. I think I was in like the beginning of high school, maybe grade 8 or grade 9, and my grandmother went on one of those trips to Palestine, like, I don't know, like propaganda trips. I don't know what they are. She came back with like a little keychain that said "Free Palestine," and she gave it to me, and I put it on my backpack, and I went to school. And I had this Jewish friend, and he was so freaked out by it. And I remember him saying something like, I can't even remember what it was, but I completely snapped at him. And I think we just never spoke again, because he was just like freaked out by how, aggressive I was about it.
Sorry, before you continue, is there a big Jewish community in South Africa?
I mean, there is a Jewish community. It's not that, I'd say it's probably equal to the Muslim community in terms of size.
Okay, so they're definitely also a minority then within South
Yeah.
Africa. Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, so those sorts of things definitely, were a big part of my childhood, and were a big part of my sort of socialization into the community and into Islam. There probably were conspiracy theories there, like, George Bush did 9/11 or whatever, but I've sort of blocked them out. Yeah, I don't quite remember.
I think there are very few fun things with Islam, but the conspiracy theories were definitely some of my more favorite things to look into. I still enjoy conspiracy theories. There aren't many that I adhere to, but I definitely enjoy them as like thought experiments or thought porn, because it's just like this alternate idea of something that could have happened. And one of the more recent ones that I heard, this was when the coronavirus first started as an outbreak. There was some guy, some sheikh, he's quite known actually, but I can't remember his name. And he was saying that the coronavirus was a ploy by Israel and the US to like thin humanity. It was ridiculous. I could not believe that it was coming out of his mouth. And he kept saying like, oh, like some scholars, they're really afraid of giving their opinion, but this is my opinion. He was like very, very like pumped about it. It was so strange. I mean, I don't listen to a lot of preachers anymore, but when I do, it's usually conspiracy theories, because I just find them so funny. And it's also an interesting trip down memory lane, because another one was that like Coca-Cola was like funding Israel, and you had to.
Oh yeah, I remember that. We were told that we were not allowed to drink Coke.
Yeah, because if you flipped the logo around, it said something bad or something like that, and like Pepsi stood for "Pay Every Penny, Save Israel" or something like that. Yeah, we had, because I went to an Islamic school, so we had a lot of like they weren't even Palestinian, they were like Algerian or something, but they were like way into like this whole Save Palestine movement, which I just want to make clear I don't have any opinion on. It's too complicated for me to get into. But they were like way into it, and like almost every other day they would like hand out pamphlets outside the school with all the different like companies, and one of which is like Procter and Gamble. Like they have a monopoly on everything, and they would be like, oh, you have to boycott these companies. Yeah, you have to boycott these companies because these companies support Israel. And my dad, who was quite conservative at the time, he was going through his Salafi kick. I showed him these pamphlets, and he was like, well, we're not going to be able to buy anything. It just gave up. But no, I this is another thing. I think that with whatever you want to call them, ex-Muslims or atheist Muslims, I think there's a lot of conspiracy theories around us as well. And I find those.
Maybe funded by Mossad. Do you work for the CIA?
Yeah. Are you being paid by Israel? Is the Illuminati involved? I think. What do you think is the reason for Muslims or the Muslim community as a whole to immediately sort of fall into conspiracies about us? I mean, there's definitely some fear in there that they're going to be influenced and taken away from their religion. But I find it funny that rather than following a logical path of, oh, they just don't agree with it, like most of the world doesn't. Most of the world is not Muslim. As opposed to, oh, they're being hired by these, Big Brother type organizations.
Yeah, I suppose if you're very invested in a religion, and if you feel like it's sort of given you meaning in life or whatever, you can't imagine that anybody would not want to, and that somebody would actually be a part of this religion and then, decide that they don't want to be a part of it. It's a lot easier to excuse someone who's never been Muslim, just never becoming Muslim. You can go, oh, well, they don't understand, or they don't, have the same experiences that I have. But when somebody is actually born inside of the community and raised in it and had all of these experiences and is still saying, oh, it's not really for me, It can be, I guess, tough to just reconcile that with the fact that it makes sense in your life. And then it becomes very easy to just sort of demonize those people. And because conspiracies are kind of a tradition, I guess, in these communities, that's the go-to. We'll just create a conspiracy about this. Yeah.
I think part of it is boredom as well.
You think?
I think part of it is boredom, because I remember there's very few things that you can have like an imagination about. You know, everything is sort of black and white with Islam. It tells you how to live and the way, and especially as a woman,
Yeah.
and like even go out and get a job is very much confined to one community. So there isn't like 100 things. And the other thing is you can't really gossip either. Gossip wasn't a thing. You know, backbiting and slander and all of that kind of stuff is a bad thing in Islam, which, I mean, I can't really say it's not a bad thing, but it's also part of human nature to do that. And I just think that stifling that is not a good thing. So there's very, very few things that you can have an imagination about. So I think that sometimes like creating these conspiracies and creating these, you know, alternate realities is driven by the mediocrity and the monotony that Islam brings into your life. So like instead of just, you know, going for the simplest possible answer of like your local ex-Muslim leaving Islam because they just don't like it, you know, it doesn't even have to be anything deep like they confirmed that God didn't exist or something like that. It should just be that they didn't like it. Like that's the simplest possible explanation that I can think of. Instead of accepting that, it seems more fun to attribute them to having like being on the payroll of MI5, you know.
It's
and
a little
I think
entertainment.
It makes your life a little bit more interesting. I know for a fact that arguing with people, for example, when I was like a Salafi Muslim and I used to proselytize a lot, mostly online, I used to really, really enjoy arguing with people. It's not something I enjoy too much now. I really have to be in the right mindset for it. But back in the day when I had nothing else to entertain me, that was what I enjoyed. And I don't know, I think it's really interesting to look into the nitty-gritty of that.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But talking about the Muslim community in South Africa, the Muslim atheist community in South Africa as well. I know that right now with COVID and, you know, global lockdowns and quarantines and things aren't really doable in terms of like physical movements. But does the organization in South Africa see themselves collaborating with any Muslim organizations in South Africa?
That's a tough one. I think
it's definitely tricky. It's definitely
it is.
Tricky.
I think there's maybe one or two organizations that are more sort of, I guess, open-minded and more accepting and so on that I wouldn't mind, you know, talking to or collaborating with. But I think that if you went for the bigger, more influential organizations, they would just either be really closed off about it, or I don't think I'd in that. But we definitely do want to be able to engage with different sectors of the community and be able to have those conversations. So, you know, it is it has its bittersweet. That's what it is. It's necessary.
I think it is quite difficult to build bridges between the two communities because we're very divided at the moment, and you know, any attempt that I have made for bridge building has always been met with some level of controversy. I think that it's really, really important to be able to talk to other communities. I'm not saying you have to be best friends with them. They don't have to be invited to your weddings and your house parties. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that having some kind of open dialogue and building a bridge between communities is important, because you can't resolve your issues and you can't come to any kind of common understanding or common ground without first having that, you know, dialogue and discussion. And I think it's really, really difficult, especially with like more conservative Dawa communities. But are there more progressive kind of organizations in South Africa, progressive Muslim organizations? We have a few LGBT Muslim organizations here in the UK, and we have some progressive Muslim organizations, but they're very, very small. So
yeah, I think we don't really. So we have one LGBT community called, I think they're called the Open Circle or the Open Mosque or something. They built a mosque and
okay.
people burnt it down. Like that's, that's
Oh,
the
no.
level. Yeah, that's where they're standing. And I suppose that's why there's only one of them, right? Because people are not brave enough to come out about that stuff. So there aren't very many communities like that. I remember a couple of years ago, I used to work for Amnesty International, and at the time, we held a sort of campaign that was on freedom of belief and so on. This was on my university campus, and we invited the university Muslim association to join us, and they are seen as one of the more progressive, in terms of the wider community. Because they're willing to speak about things like race and gender, and they have women on their board and so on. So you think, okay, well, that's one of the more progressive organizations. They flat out refused to attend at all. We had representatives at that event from the Hindu community, from the Jewish community, from the Baha'i society, but the Muslim society just refused to come. And I think, breaking down, being able to have those conversations is also just breaking down the stigmatization. I think we make efforts towards it, but it's really a two-way stream, and
definitely. A few months back, it was at some point last year, I think it was in October, I was giving a speech on a panel with other apostates from other faiths in Bristol, and I had made it a point to invite the ISOC, I believe it's called, or the Islamic Society of that university, and they seemed to take it as some kind of an insult when it wasn't meant that way. And I don't know, it does feel as though people are reluctant to listen to the opposing side, and I think that that's very discouraging to see. But I also think that as time goes on, there's definitely been some kind of a progress in terms of how people feel about the ex-Muslim movement, because it's definitely moved away from they deserve to die. It's moved away from that. It's become more of, oh, they shouldn't speak, which I see as a progress. And I think as time goes on, that progress will continue.
I just want to comment real quick before you go on, Haafizah, about what Faye was just mentioning. I think it was last week's broadcast. I went ahead and as a matter of fact, M provided me with a list of Muslims, and I tweeted out to them about our broadcast. And most of the responses we got were pretty negative. Why would I want to listen to this, or why would I want to see that?
Oh, wow.
It kind of bugs me because, as I've mentioned many times on this broadcast, folks like Faye and Zara and Shmariana and other folks on Twitter, they're the first ones to step up and call people out when they try to be Muslim haters and talk about maybe doing violence to Muslims, or so they've got their back when people are going after Muslims, but it doesn't seem to be too reciprocal very much from the Muslim community.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think that there's a lot of openness, and I don't think that there's a lot of solidarity between the two. It would be interesting to see what it looks like in 5 or 10 years' time, if there's a little bit more progress on that front.
I agree. I definitely think that sometimes it can be a very punishing role to stand up for people that you necessarily agree with, because you drive a certain level of you into your
Mhm.
circle to say what they have to say, and I think it can be very, very uncomfortable. But we have to meet in the middle somewhere. You know, at the end
Yeah.
of the day, we still need to live with each other and coexist on some
Yeah.
level. So I don't know. I think that there's a lot of people who disagree with me in saying that there's no point in talk guide. There's no point in hearing them out. And I just simply disagree. I think that there's always room to talk about something. There's always room for improvement. And, you know, your enemy, that's fewer enemies, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that the other thing with ex-Muslims, non-Muslims, whatever, you know, anyone who is not a Muslim, I think the other thing is that a lot of Muslims in the Muslim community are unable to humanize them or put them on the
Mhm.
same level as other Muslims. And I don't think they do this intentionally. I do think that it is something that is indoctrinated into people.
Yeah,
And, you
definitely.
know, for myself, who was raised quite conservative and, you know, practiced quite conservative, it really took me meeting people who were not from the Muslim faith to understand that they're just like me and they are people. So if, you know, these preachers never actually engage with us and never actually talk to us, I don't think
Mm.
that they'll ever be able to realize that we are human beings with, you know, our own families and our own lives who are capable of making our own decisions, and we're not just a mission, you know, or a
Mm.
threat to a mission.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think it's a lot of work, and it's definitely, you know, the role that you kind of play as and as an ex-Muslim atheist, Muslim activist is a difficult one because it's a there's a constant pushback. But it is
Mm,
important that we are able to, like you said, humanize ourselves in the eyes of the Muslim community, because a lot of people perhaps haven't even met an ex-Muslim, or haven't
oh, you're
ever
breaking
spoken
up
to an ex-Muslim,
a fair
or
bit.
sorry, can you hear me
I
now?
didn't really. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was just saying that it's like you said, it's about humanizing ex-Muslims, and the only way to do that is to, you know, begin having those difficult conversations and so on. And it's not just about speaking to the preachers or the imams or whoever, but just ordinary people, you know, and creating that discourse. It is important.
Well, and I just wanted to add too, there's probably many Muslims out there that interact with ex-Muslims every day, but they don't
I
even
don't know
realize
it.
it because those folks are closeted. You know,
Mhm.
it's just like I've argued with friends of mine or acquaintances of mine that that are anti-gay. Well, I don't encounter gay people. I don't deal with them, and I always tell them, no, you encounter gay people every day. You just don't know it. I mean, and it's not the same now as it was. I'm in my 50s, and years ago, a big portion of the gay community was still closeted, because it just wasn't accepted. And,
Mhm.
people that think they weren't encountering gay people were sadly mistaken. There was people in their circle, people in their family that were gay, and they didn't realize it because they had to remain
Yeah.
closeted.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that it's really, really easy to demonize somebody that you don't agree with,
Hmm.
or has one aspect of a thing that you value that's different to them. And I think that the only way that we can counter that is by having conversations, and I just see that lacking, and I would like to see more of it. And I wouldn't want to be the only one doing it, because that would make my life very, very difficult. Um, But I think that's all of my questions, John. I don't really have much more to ask. Is there anything you wanted to ask Hafiza, or are there any questions in the live chat?
Well, no. As a matter of fact, the live chat seems to be doing their own thing, like often happens. There's
Yeah.
a Christian person in there that everybody is arguing back and forth with, and this person, Meek and Pure, is their handle, and they seem to be posting a lot of stuff, but not responding to the queries from other people. But that often happens.
Can Meek and Pure please let us know when he's going to inherit the earth? Because I would like an update.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing is maybe a half hour ago, they were talking about, what was going on in the riots, and someone that has the name Meek and Pure posted that people who destroy property may even deserve death. So that kind of blew my mind. Not very meek and pure to post such a thought. But now, forgive me if I had to step away for a little bit. So forgive me if Faye already asked you about this. But my only question I want to ask is, so how long have you been an ex-Muslim? And then is everybody in your sphere, friends and family, do they know that you're an ex-Muslim? Haafizah?
Yeah, so I've been I don't know, I think my connection's breaking up a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've been ex-Muslim since a couple of years. I think 2016, I don't know, so it's been a couple of years. Yeah, I did at some point tell my immediate family. So I've spoken with sort of my mom, my dad, my siblings, but I haven't completely come out to my extended family. And that was just something that my mother and I agreed on, that, maybe we can tone it down when we're with the extended family, because it is difficult for her. And I do, I don't want to be the person who's kind of always, pushing the boundaries for her and so on. It has to be a compromise. So I was like, that's an acceptable compromise, because we don't really engage with the extended family. So yeah, but to all of my friends, my coworkers and so on, I'm completely out. And I think I've had it relatively easy. My family is not as conservative as other families, so I've not, been kicked out or disowned or anything. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've heard that from a lot of, ex-Muslims that, they've been advised by those that do know to maybe not make it a widely known thing.
Yeah.
And especially depending on where you live in the world. So yeah, I think we can kind of close things out here. Before we get to close things out, though, I would like to give you an opportunity, Haafizah, to give us the nuts and bolts of your organization again.
There are 2 questions in the live chat.
Okay, go right ahead.
So Haafizah, there's Iron Charioteer has asked, what do you think of Ahmed Deedat and his movement and debates with Christian scholars?
Oh, that douchebag.
I do not mind him too much.
He's so influential.
But go on.
He's been so influential sort of in the community, and yeah, he's a problematic dude. Yeah. I think it's I don't know, as an atheist, it's silly for me that somebody would argue that one religion is somehow truer or realer than another religion when it's all not at all true. But yeah, he's a huge douche.
I haven't re-listened to him in a while. I haven't re-listened to him since I was a Muslim. So for me, I used to respect Ahmed Deedat a lot. Maybe I need to rewatch some of his stuff. To me, he was always like the old granddad type, like he's just rambling and it's fine sort of thing. But yeah, I get that. For someone who actually lives in South Africa, I could probably understand why you probably wouldn't like him as much.
Oh, that douche. Yeah, that kind of sums it up right there.
He's like an old man. Calling an old man a douche is a little, at least for me, it's a little crazy.
Impolite, a little bit impolite.
Where do you envision atheist Muslims of South Africa going in the next few years?
I think it's had a really good sort of, and maybe this is a something that I shouldn't be saying, but it's had a very good organic growth, just from people who find out about us and they're so excited. And they come in with all of these new ideas, and we're just like, yeah, let's do that, let's do this. So it's had a really great growth. I think at this point we have a a good, solid sort of foundation as an organization, and especially as, you know, in terms of the aspect of the atheist community that we're sort of growing, where we're, you know, trying to have, you know, interactions with each other and make people feel comfortable and make people feel safe. So I think at this point, the real work has to be done on the front of, you know, actually going out and speaking about things more publicly. And we've had some conversations about wanting to do things like that. But yeah, it is an exciting journey, and looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, I'll be keeping up to date with all of the different things, especially since Shmariana has become quite a close confidant of mine.
He's great.
One of my favorite
thank
tweeters on Twitter. I put Shmariana right up there with Faye as far as one of my favorite Twitterverse people. And so now you mentioned that you're on Facebook and on Twitter. Haafizah, do you have a YouTube channel?
We don't. We're just on Facebook and Twitter.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it for now.
And then if you would now, of course, I can find your you know, your Twitter link or whatever, you know, because we're in DMs together. But could you go ahead and DM me the link to the Facebook so I can get that in the video description once this posts as a video?
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
And then is there
Definitely.
anything more about your organization that you wanted to say, or anything that you have coming up that you'd like people to know about?
I think we've pretty much covered it. We're kind of at a go slow at the moment. I did mention to Faye, just because, you know, of the lockdown and the whole situation. Yeah, but I think it'll be nice if you guys promote our social media and we can engage with more people. Thank you for that.
Absolutely. And I can't believe I just said absolutely, because I always hate when other people use that word. But so just want to mention too that you know, here on the Rage, you know, aside from, you know, mine and Faye's podcast every Sunday, the Rage has been putting out a lot of content. I would say that Nakasuchi puts out a video 4 or 5 times a week. You know, so please, you know, like and subscribe this channel and check out some of Knox content. And please let people know about this podcast. We want to really get the word out to, you know, everybody, religious folks and apostates alike. We're not afraid to have, you know, religious folks come over and see these podcasts and interact with us. I also want to say that next week at some time, we're going to reboot the ongoing series that was around several months ago called John Learns New Shit. And we're going to bring some people on to talk about some philosophical conversations. And, you know, hopefully I'll be able to learn from folks that know more about that than I do. And I also want to give Faye, because there was a few questions about it in the chat, or a few comments on it in the chat earlier. What's with the makeup today, Faye?
Oh, I'm just in a mood. The lockdown's driving me absolutely up the wall. And I just wanted to do something different.
Yeah, somebody referred to it as Braveheart makeup.
Yeah, it was Shmariana.
I also want to point out, as far as Faye goes, get over her channel and check out her cosplay video from the other day, where I won't even tell you who she was. I'll let you figure that out when you watch the video. And also, Faye has the voice of an angel. She posted a video where she was singing as this cosplay character. And I got to tell you, you'll never listen to Adele again once you hear Faye. So,
you'll never listen to Adele again because you won't be able to hear.
right. And now, let's see. I'm just checking my notes to make sure I covered everything. Again, Haafizah, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure and check out the video description later today for Haafizah's links. And next week, once again, we're going to have Ammon, Shmeriana Shmande, as they're known on Twitter. And that's going to post as a premiere because M is not available at the time we usually do this broadcast. So we're going to record it the day before, and then we will do it as a premiere at 11 o'clock Eastern right here on The Rage again next week. And as we like to say, the Apostate Alliance is where you can be free to not believe.